As the polls tighten and with days to go, can Hillary Clinton defeat Donald Trump and win a historic election? I'll ask a former critic turned ally of hers, the Oscar-winning filmmaker and director of Trumpland, Michael Moore. Michael Moore, thanks for joining me on UpFront. We have an election right now that's about to take place in which on one side you have Hillary Clinton, a former Secretary of State, a former senator, going up against a guy, Donald Trump, the Republican candidate, who said outrageous things about Muslims, Mexicans, women, the disabled, veterans, African Americans. He's accused of sexual assault. He's openly ignorant about foreign affairs. Why is this race still so close?
Exactly. Well, I've lived here as an American all my life, so I know the country I live in. This is a nation that twice elected a B actor whose co-star was a chimpanzee.
Ronald Reagan.
Ronald Reagan. The state of Minnesota once elected a professional wrestler as a governor. So, you know, we live in an interesting country, and sadly, though, Trump is the embodiment of just about every bad trait you could come up with. It's like if you went to Dr. Frankenstein last year and said, "Hey, give me a creature that embodies all the worst traits of men, white people, and rich people, and put them all in one guy, and we're gonna run him as a candidate." Thus, you have Donald J. Trump.
Your new movie, Michael Moore in Trumpland, why did you make it? What was the point, given we seem to live in a post-truth political age, where especially to Trump voters who think Barack Obama is a secret Kenyan or Hillary Clinton has body doubles, to them facts don't matter anymore. Evidence doesn't seem to matter. You can't seem to get through to them, can you?
Well, that's why I decided not to give them a fact-based movie. Now, there are in this movie a few gently disguised facts that I sort of, slip in there. But no, this is more, I decided to give them a comedy show, basically. And I perform a one-man show for them and get them laughing about themselves and Trump. And maybe you see in the process of this hour, they realize that, yeah, it is kind of ridiculous, isn't it, to vote for this guy? At least some of them feel that way.
As you say, you try and use humor. You try not to attack Trump voters, but try and understand their rage. You call it righteous anger, justifiable anger, the idea of losing jobs, having factories outsourced, stagnating wages. It's a common argument that's used to explain the rise of Trump, but many would say the evidence doesn't support that view. Studies show that Trump voters on average have higher incomes than Clinton voters. They have higher incomes than the average American. They don't tend to live in areas that have been hit hard by free trade or outsourcing or low-skilled immigrants. The studies, Michael, seem to show that they're driven more by racial resentment, by anti-minority sentiment, than by economic insecurity.
I think that probably is true for half or even the majority of them, but not all of them. And I'm not trying to reach the majority. Those who are motivated by their racism are lost. And I don't know if they can be convinced of anything by Tuesday. But there is, I think most people would agree, 20, 30% maybe of his support that are not people, they're not racist, they are people who have suffered through hard times and are mad at the system. And I know, I live in Michigan, so I live amongst them. I listen to them every day in the diner, the coffee shop, on the street, nonstop. And they are angry.
And do you think the Democratic presidential candidate, Hillary Clinton, is the right candidate? Was she the right person for the Democrats to put up to win over those angry people? During the Bill Clinton presidency, for example, when welfare reform was enacted, when extreme poverty went up, when the NAFTA free trade treaty was signed, a lot of those people are the kind of people you're talking about who felt left behind, who felt angry. Hillary Clinton's husband was president for 2 terms when that happened. She backed his policies. How is she, therefore, the solution to Trump or to Trumpism today?
Well, first of all, I have a couple things to say about that. the best candidate to run against Trump was called Bernie Sanders. So that's who I supported. And I think this wouldn't be so close and we wouldn't be so nervous were he the candidate. But he didn't win. And this is the candidate we have. So, as Don Rumsfeld once famously said, you go into battle with the army that you have. And this is who we have. Having said that, I don't know if she is that same Mrs. Bill Clinton that you described, supporting all those policies of his. In fact, a couple times this year, she's thrown him under the bus for what he did in the 90s. I think, and I hope that she is a different person. She says she is. She's adopted 2/3 of Bernie's platform.
You say you hope she's a different person, and you say, is she the person that she was in the 90s that I described? But it's not just about the 90s. One of her best-known critics said earlier this year that she's Wall Street's paid candidate.
I think I said that.
I think you did. It was you. So how did
it
we
was
change?
me.
It was you. I'm quoting you. Good. You know your own quote. So earlier this year, Michael, earlier this year, you were saying she was Wall Street's paid candidate. In the space of a few months, she can't suddenly stop being Wall Street's paid candidate.
Well, she said that she's going to do some things, that she agrees with Bernie, that she's going to do some things to put controls on them.
But saying, Michael, is different to doing, isn't it? We know from her emails that she holds different positions in private than she holds in public. She's a politician. Yes.
She's a politician. Right. So what else do we have to go on? I'm not on the ballot. If it was me, I could sit here and tell you what I'm going to do, and you could choose to believe me or not believe me. But this is what we have to work with here.
Okay. Well,
so I have no choice at this point, especially considering who the other candidate is, but to believe that she's going to follow through on her word. And if she doesn't, as I've said in my movie, I'm going to be her worst nightmare, as are millions of other people who voted for Bernie Sanders. The revolution isn't going away.
You're going to hold her to account.
We're going to be there the day after. Absolutely.
Well,
absolutely. We're not going to do like we did with Obama. Remember, with Obama, we voted for him. He got in. We were, this is so great. And then within a month, he appointed Timothy Geithner as the Treasury Secretary, Wall Street guy. Yeah. Larry Summers as the head of his economic policy. And it was like, whoa. But we didn't stay active. We didn't stay on him. And we let 2 years go by.
One of the areas which a lot of progressive people on the left are very concerned about when it comes to Hillary Clinton is foreign policy. You have rightly said that women tend to be less hawkish in office, less likely to shoot things up, less likely to drop bombs. That's what the studies show. You've also conceded there are notable exceptions to that rule. Margaret Thatcher in the UK comes to mind. Why do you think Hillary Clinton, given Iraq, given Libya, given her positions on Syria, on Israel, on Russia, why would she be an exception to that rule?
Yeah, she supports right now, I think the United States is bombing 7 different countries right now. And she supports every single one of those efforts. In fact, she doesn't think Obama's gone far enough on some of them, like with Syria. She wants to enforce a no-fly zone.
Yep.
And no, listen, I go into this with eyes wide open. I believe that there is a better chance than not of Hillary Clinton getting us into a war. But there is a far greater chance of a different kind of war with Donald J. Trump. So we, the American voters, are being asked to choose which war do you want, a Hillary Clinton war or a Donald J. Trump war.
Slavoj Žižek, the Slovenian philosopher, I'm sure you know him, has said in an interview this week that someone like him, if he could vote in the American election, he'd vote for Trump because Trump will shake things up. Hillary Clinton is the status quo candidate. What do you say to people on the left who say that kind of thing? So there's a fair few of them who say that.
I understand how pleasurable it is to be an anarchist. And Trump is actually presenting himself as an anarchist because he's actually used those words, I will blow up the system. And there are people who believe, you know what, maybe that's what we need. Let's blow it up and rebuild it. But you don't want your chief builder, who's going to be rebuilding it, to be Donald J. Trump. So I don't take that position. And I think I don't want to take that risk. It's too dangerous. To let Trump blow it up.
If we wake up next Wednesday morning and Donald Trump has been elected 45th President of the United States, what's your advice? Civil disobedience, seek asylum in Canada, run for the hills?
Oh no, there's no running away. And don't put this on the Canadians either. They are so nervous up in Canada. Somebody just told me my movie's #1 up there right now. And I said, yeah, of course it is, because they're all like, no. You know, they do not want us coming up there and bringing our guns with us. No, you can't leave the country. If this sad thing happens, we're all going to have to stay here and fight. And we'll all be in the French resistance. And we're all going to have to act like the tanks are 20 miles outside of Paris. That's basically where we're going to be. You know, non-violently fight.
Michael Moore, thanks for joining me on UpFront.
Hey, thanks for having me. I love your show. Appreciate it.
The big banks. Back in 2008, they almost crashed the global economy. Today, though, we can trust them to learn their lessons, to change, to be more responsible, right? Don't bank on it. According to a recent report co-authored by President Obama's own former top economic advisor, Larry Summers, big banks are no safer now than they were before the financial crisis, and the possibility of a too-big-to-fail scenario still looms. Look, the whole reason there was a multi-billion-dollar bailout in 2008 was because the banks were deemed too big, too important. If they crashed, everything crashed. So everyone agreed those mega banks had to be reined in, made smaller. Too big to fail would soon become a relic of a discredited, reckless past. But hold on, what's this? Of the 15 banks that received the most bailout money, 11 are now bigger than they were before the recession, even after adjusting for inflation. Oh dear. And it gets worse. A recent official review found 5 of the US's biggest banks failed to persuade regulators they could go bankrupt without disrupting the broader financial system. Senator Elizabeth Warren, an expert on financial reform and bankruptcy laws, called the news scary. Apparently, size does matter. Remember, being too big to fail also means too big to jail. Only one Wall Street banker was prosecuted and imprisoned in the wake of the crash, an Egyptian-born mid-level executive at Credit Suisse called Kareem Serageldin. The rest, including the bosses, got off scot-free. Sorry, Kareem. See, no punishment equals no consequences and no real lessons learned. Look at the recent news that Wells Fargo, the massive US retail bank, is launching a stealth attack on the investment banking world. Yes, the same Wells Fargo that built itself into the world's most valuable bank in the wake of the financial crisis, partly because it did not rely on risky trades or complex derivatives. On a side note, Wells Fargo did recently get fined $185 million for creating over 2 million false accounts. But anyways, now it wants to get into derivatives, despite legendary investor Warren Buffett having famously described derivatives as financial weapons of mass destruction. But here's the teeny-weeny irony. Buffett has a 10% stake in Wells Fargo and seems to be on board with the bank's plans. So, get bigger and bigger in size, go for investment banking over retail banking, expand into complex derivatives, and wait for the next crash. Have these people learned nothing? Amid soaring inflation, protests on the streets, and a media crackdown, the two sides of a polarized Venezuela, government and opposition, have accepted the Pope's request to sit down for talks. But what's happened to the leftist revolution that the late Hugo Chavez launched in 1999? And what should Venezuela do now? Before the announcement of the talks, I sat down with Timur Porras, the former chief of staff for Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and a former advisor to the late President Chavez, and economist Ricardo Hausmann, director of Harvard Center for International Development and a former Minister of Planning in Venezuela in the early 1990s. Earlier this year, he wrote it's probably too late to avoid a Venezuelan catastrophe altogether. So I began by asking him what caused the catastrophe.
Well, I mean, I said that in January, and the catastrophe is here. That's what is making Venezuela so newsworthy lately. I think essentially what happened is that President Hugo Chavez used the period of high oil prices not to put some money aside, but to quintuple the foreign debt. So then the year of his election, when the price of oil was at 100, he was spending as if the price of oil was at 200, running a huge deficit. So then markets stopped lending to the country, so they could no longer afford to be spending as if the price of oil was at 200 and borrow the difference. And now the price of oil is at 40 or so for the Venezuelan crude.
Okay, let Timur Porras come in there and respond to some of that.
Inflation.
I think that mainly the problem is that you have been predicting that catastrophe for 17 years. I mean, when the government in Venezuela was doing well, they were already predicting a catastrophe. When I think there's a lot of ideological points of view in there. You're mixing, the President Chavez's term with the actual situation of Venezuela. You're saying that the debt was quintupled, while you don't mention the fact that the GDP of the country was multiplied by 3. The country is not over-indebted. The GDP to debt ratio is lower than in many developed countries. It's not a problem of amount of debt. It's a problem of management of that debt. Venezuela has issues with accessing.
Before I bring Ricardo back in, let me ask you to answer the same question I asked him. What is behind this current crisis? Surely you would accept there is a crisis right now in Venezuela.
Of course.
So what's caused it?
Unlike Ricardo Hausmann, I live in Caracas, so of course there's no issue about that. There has been a sharp fall in oil prices, and there has been, I would say, a management of that crisis that has been deficient, to my opinion. But linking, this ideologic idea that the left in Venezuela is not viable, that the Chavista project has failed, while it managed to secure at least 10 years of GDP growth, managed to secure the reduction of 49% in inequalities and in poverty. Globally, the Chavista project is a success in Venezuela that is going through very, very tough times today.
Okay. Are you saying that the entire project is a failure because of the current catastrophe, despite all the gains that Tamir outlines?
Tamir is entitled to his own opinions. He's not entitled to his own facts. He said that the debt of Venezuela is not very big. Venezuela has a public foreign debt of $150 billion. $150 billion. Venezuela exports about $25 billion, maybe $30 billion. So the foreign debt is 6 years of exports. That is a huge debt. That is one of the biggest debts in the world. That is the reason why financial markets don't want to lend to Venezuela anymore. And that's the reason why Venezuela needs to restructure its debt and seek financial assistance. But this government has decided that they don't want to go there.
Exactly
they would rather default on the Venezuelan period.
Venezuela should go to the IMF. Is the old neoliberal recipe the only thing we have to give to the Venezuelan people?
Well, you can give starvation and hunger and inflation and so on. Look at what you've done.
The foreign news reports right now of Venezuela tend to paint quite harrowing scenes of food shortages, food riots, Venezuelans without medicine. Is that inaccurate?
There is a crisis. There is an economic crisis in Venezuela. What is inaccurate is to depict Venezuela as Ethiopia when it run food shortages. The problem in Venezuela is not the lack of food, it's not the lack of supply. I live in Venezuela and they eat. It's a problem of pricing. Inflation is very high and it's very hard for people.
It's going to hit 700% according to some studies.
How do you know that? Where does that Professor Hausmann keeps saying that there are no official figures. And he's probably right.
What do you think the inflation rate is?
No, it's very high, but what is it? Why?
If it's not 700,
I don't have a crystal ball.
You're saying
to
it's not 700.
It's absolutely.
It's going to hit 700 as a prediction.
Inaccurate to predict.
Okay, let me ask Ricardo Hausmann this question.
Like
you were obviously you were a minister of planning back in the early 90s in one of the predecessor governments prior to Chavez coming to power, and that government took IMF money, did structural reforms. I think they liberalised petrol prices. People took to the streets. They were shot at. They were killed. Hundreds were killed in those protests. You talk about freedoms being extinguished now. That happened on your watch too.
It didn't happen on my watch.
Well, it happened under the watch of the president you served, President Perez.
First of all, let's get some points clear. If Venezuela was such a democracy, we wouldn't have over 100 political prisoners. If Venezuela was so full of food, there wouldn't be hundreds of thousands of people a week crossing the border to Colombia to buy food.
Okay, so I'm going to ask Tamir to respond to all of that, but only after you respond to my question, which is, when your president was in power, the president you served, who was then impeached under corruption charges, he sent out the army to shoot at people who were protesting over high petrol prices. It wasn't some utopia when you were in government, is what I'm saying.
It was the period similar to this one, where there was a decline in the oil price. The previous government had not saved the money.
And the president you served shot at hundreds of people in the street. Did people not die in the Caracas?
How can it be similar when you had a center-left, or allegedly center-left, president implementing right-wing politics.
This is Carlos Andrés Pérez.
Carlos Andrés Pérez,
This is
absolutely.
not right-wing
and
politics.
this is the reason.
This is the policies of what happens when you run out of oil and you didn't make your savings. And that is the same catastrophe that is currently being lived in
When you do not care about
Venezuela.
your national sovereignty, and when you're ready to handle...
What national sovereignty? The only thing you care about is paying the Wall Street bonds and screwing the Venezuelan people. That's what you call sovereignty.
Well, I mean...
Do you agree with him on the debt?
Absolutely not. I do not agree on the debt. He's lobbying for his friends who are enjoying the subsidized dollars for imports. I've been shocked how you... When you depict these food shortages, you mainly speak about beer and Coca-Cola. I have read that 3 times. You're depicting Venezuela as if it were an economy owned by the state. It's mainly a privately owned economy, and I think it's one of the problems, the attitude of the private sector in Venezuela.
Just also deal with the political point that Ricardo Hasman raised.
Which made huge amounts of money during the oil.
Just deal with the point Ricardo Hasman raised about political prisoners.
I wouldn't call that a situation of political prisoners. You should know that Leopoldo López and the other people who are in prison today are people who were willing to overthrow the government and took concrete actions to that. I do not mean, in my personal opinion, the judiciary shouldn't solve political problems.
But you are aware that international human rights groups have written some pretty scathing reports about
international human rights
treatment of prisoners, treatment of the media, treatment of protesters.
That do not criticize the parliamentary coup in Brazil, that only advocate for some causes and are biased in their views of the countries depending on where they are situated. Yes, the thing is that, in my personal opinion, the judiciary shouldn't step in to solve Venezuela's political problems.
Okay, well,
and that's
let me put this point to Ricardo Hasman. You're
solution.
obviously, given your past, you were in government before. A lot of people might say, well, you just want to turn the clock back. You want to kind of eliminate all of the gains that Chavez and Chavismo did make. Clearly, there were gains in terms of cuts in poverty, cuts in inequality, new schools, etc., etc.
Investing the oil money in the people.
Is that, what would you say to those critics who say you want to turn back the clock?
Why turn back the clock? I mean, the world has moved on, right?
Positively in some ways in Venezuela. You would accept that, right?
Absolutely. Well, not in Venezuela.
Not in Venezuela. There were no gains made on the social, economic, child poverty, inequality fronts at all.
Well, the government has stopped publishing poverty statistics. But the consortium, the government of Maduro stopped in 2014 stopped publishing
but Chavez died in 2013.
Numbers.
Just talk about the Chavez period.
Yes, but
you would accept that there were social economic gains made on his watch.
I think those gains were based on $100 oil and $100 a year in borrowing.
Fair enough.
That we cannot
But
pay
the gains
anymore.
were made. But they were gains. Poor people's lives improved. That's all I'm asking.
People's lives unsustainably improved. They destroy unsustainably. That's why we're in a crisis now.
They're all being undone now. Those gains are being undone.
Absolutely.
Dramatically so. Dramatically
you're pretending that those gains, which are profound, absolutely not. That oil money was invested in what? In education?
Why are so many Venezuelans leaving the country? Why is now the Dominican Republic, Panama, Colombia, Chile,
because
Spain,
there's a huge economic crisis.
I want to ask you one question before we end. A year from now, 2 years from now, what is the state of Venezuela's economy going to be? I'm going to start with you, Ricardo.
Well, if Maduro is out soon, I think that we can turn the country around relatively quickly with sound economic policies supported by the international financial community and supported by the people who, from a majority
sound economic policies being balanced budgets, austerity.
It means freeing people to be able to own their things, to invest, and to have reasonable
prices. What's the economy going to look like?
You're depicting a state-run economy. I, as any other Venezuelan citizens, own my things in Venezuela. Please come from time to time to see we're not a communist economy. Venezuela is going through hard times.
What's it going to look like going forward, a year, 2 years from now?
Well, if we do not accept that radical approach that depicts the country as collapsing and people start to get together and tackle the real issues and not think that getting rid of your political adversaries is going to bring about stability, things will be better.
Who's putting political adversaries in jail?
And who is calling for an
A recall
overthrow?
referendum. Ask the people to get rid of Maduro.
The only referendum in Venezuela was held in 2004, and you called it a fraud, while the OAS and the Carter Center said it was valid. So once again, there's a lot of mistrust in Venezuela. We have to build trust and focus on the real
We'll have
issues.
to leave it there. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me in the arena. That's our show. Up Front will be back next week.